I'm joined tonight by a panel of distinguished commentators, experts, participants, and observers in government for many long years standing, and I'm going to introduce them, but I'm going to introduce them as we go to get this discussion moving rather than sit here and listen to a lot of people talk about how swell they are themselves. They can do that as they answer a question. If you're a Chicago Bears fan, you may remember a few years back when the Bears just beat the heck out of the Arizona Cardinals. And the coach at that time of the Cardinals was a man named Dennis Green, who you may recall was also coach of Northwestern at one time. And after the game, he was asked about what he thought of the Bears. And he said, "The Bears are just who we thought they were." So the question for the panel as we get started here is Rahm Emanuel just who we thought he is? Another way of saying that is, are we surprised by what we've seen so far? And our first answer is going to be coming from John Rose, independent political analyst, political consultant, and observer of long-standing. Were you surprised? Have you been surprised? Is Rahm Emanuel who we thought he was?
Well, he's pretty much who I thought he was. I didn't vote for him. I see him very much as much of the world sees him, as a technocrat without much of a, what should I say, a humane or belief core, a technocrat first, who has made some very interesting moves on the technocratic end, and in so doing has made some very serious mistakes on the humane or content end. We'll expand on this.
Yeah, we'll talk about those things as we go on. Our next panelist, Rick Munoz, alderman of the 22nd Ward for nigh on to 18 years, is what I can remember before he was there, but it's been 18 years now. Rick, we knew Rahm Emanuel back when he worked for Mayor Daley, and we've seen him develop, but has he surprised you at all in his new role as mayor?
No, he continues to be focused. He continues to be driven, and as Don mentioned, he continues to be a technocrat in his ability or in his way of dealing with not just policy, but also with the city council.
All right, and next is Misha Patel, Executive Director of the Grassroots Collaborative, community-based labor organization. Rahm Emanuel, I don't know what your expectations of him were, but has he confounded your expectations, exceeded them, fallen short of them, or were you surprised at all?
No, we weren't surprised. The same answer you're getting. I think it was pretty clear his reputation preceded him, and I think since he's been in office, sort of is notorious for his high-packed schedule and how much he's been doing, and that's clear, but also his perspectives and attitudes around labor and around working families. There has been very little that's been surprising about what he's done in the first 6 months.
And finally on our panel is Richard Barnett, veteran West Side political organizer. I don't even want to guess how many years that's been the case, but you've seen them come and go. Mr. Barnett, is Rahm Emanuel a surprise to you in any way?
No, not at all.
I'm seeing the same sense of theme here.
His reputation preceded him from Washington when he was on the president's staff, and what he said that the Black Caucus could do when they asked for an appointment with the president. And I think that he's one that our community, I think, is going to have to get together to talk to him, because there's some disrespect.
Let's get down to cases now. Before he's got the budget working through the city council now, and we're going to get into that, but one of the things he talked about early on in his campaign is that he has promised a more transparent government. As a matter of fact, he has moved more records on things like purchasing online. He's banned the revolving door lobbying from people on the staff. But the question I have is that enough? Amisha, what do you think? Can he do more to make government open and accessible to the general public?
Absolutely. I think even the Chicago Reader came up with this piece this week talking about how it was so hard to even get his schedule, that you were able to get a better sense of what our mayor did when he was chief of staff of the United States of America than you can when he's the mayor of our city. And so I think there's been a lot of talk about transparency, and certainly some things have been made more accessible, but there's a lot more that still is really hard to access. For example, My organization has sent in FOIAs to the city to find out about actually how much TIF money is currently in the city that's unallocated, and we just continue to get the runaround. And so I think if there was some real serious intention about it, it'd be a lot easier to get information that is actually the right of the public to have.
Now, Rick Munoz, as far as transparency is concerned, you look at this from two perspectives. One, in your dealings with him as an alderman, and second, from what you hear from your constituents. Is this administration open enough?
Not open enough, but a lot more open than the Daley administration. With well over 200 data sets that they've made available in searchable format. Part of what the Daley administration was really famous for is every time we asked a question, they'd give us books and reams of books of
Overwhelming
data,
with paperwork.
overwhelming us,
Yeah.
and okay, go figure it out. In this case, the administration, both through the Department of Housing and Economic Development on the economic development side, and on the operational side with streets and sanitation and with other departments, just making these data sets available in searchable format. That is a huge technological difference from just being able to view a PDF that gives you data versus a searchable database where then you can actually just play with the data and then figure it out. So they've come a long way from the Daley administration, but there's still some to do.
Mr. Barnett, from the perspective of community organizers, how important is it that the public have good access to everything that's being done at City Hall without going down and going through all the changes that usually are necessary?
I think the mayor should have much more hands-on as far as the west side is concerned. There are 7 TIFs on the west side. There's no one from the west side black community that has any say-so in TIF. The people that make the decisions, none of them live on the west side.
Don, you know that it's important for administrations to have the ability to control information for a lot of reasons. It's also important for information to be made available. How's this guy doing at that?
Well, he's doing okay in some areas and lousy in others. As you may know, the ACLU has had to file a suit to find out what the actual deployment of Chicago police is. Now, this is an extremely important issue. Crime in some of our very, very poorest neighborhoods is the #1 issue, along with bad schools. These go hand in hand usually. And they won't tell us what the deployment of police is. It would be nice to know, and Ram has already said that he is opposed to the kind of redeployment that Jody Weiss had proposed, which was to really a simple-minded idea that even Ram could understand with his technocratic mind. You put more police where there is more crime. But that's a politically unpopular idea. Because the people out in Edgebrook who do not have the same amount of crime in Inglewood don't want to surrender any of their police officers to those people. And so they're keeping it a big secret. Now that's really a dangerous kind of non-transparency. Is that the word, or do we call it opacity?
Lack of opacity. I like that.
Opacity is
Yeah.
a good word.
Don't say opacity too much.
A lot more is necessary besides redeployment. We really need a true community policing in those areas if we're going to get rid of crime. He said absolutely nothing about that. He may technocratically give us the redeployment, but will he give us community policing?
Well, this is something I want to get into this with Rick Munoz a little bit, because it gets into the budget issue that we've been talking about for the last couple of days or weeks in the news. And one of the areas of pushback that some of the aldermen have made is against the notion of closing three Chicago police stations. A number of aldermen, 28, Rick, I think, or so, have signed a letter expressing some of their problem areas, discontent, things they'd like to see different from what Ram has proposed. But as far as police deployment is concerned, as far as tipping your hand about what you're doing about that, is that something that aldermen are concerned about?
It's on our list, and the mayor 2 weeks ago presented his budget to the city council, and we went through 2 weeks of city council hearings. And after having not received the satisfactory answers from the commissioners and the superintendent of police and everybody else that came to testify before us, lo and behold, a couple of us held a couple of meetings, and we said, hey, there's a couple of concerns we have. Amongst them, the library cuts, amongst them the OEMC cuts, the Office of Emergency Communications, which is public safety, police. Amongst them were the closings of the stations, and decided to author a letter that basically said we need additional information and we'd like to talk to you about it. And lo and behold, from that came this list of 28 aldermen who all shared the same concern.
Not exactly the 95 theses, but I mean, you presented the letter to the administration, right?
It was, we started off with like 40 items at the meeting we had on Sunday evening, and we boiled it down to the top 5. And obviously, libraries, mental health, public safety were in the top 3. We're in that process. They got the letter yesterday, and we're trying to see if they're negotiating in good faith on how we might be able to prevent these cuts or mitigate the cuts in order to, just provide for a safer city.
Now, Amisha, we're talking about whether or not Rahm Emanuel's been doing a good job these past 6 months. Does his response to the concerns of these aldermen and others, how will that help you decide if he is a responsive mayor or if he's going to just try to ramrod his ideas through?
Well, I think the mayor has an opportunity to really engage with aldermen and constituents in the city who are actually really clearly pushing for the fact that we've got to maintain services and key services. And everybody knows there's a budget crisis, but frankly, we believe that it's a revenue crisis, and there's actually plenty of money there to meet some of the needs. And in particular, that there is unallocated TIF dollars, so tax increment financing dollars, that are sitting around that are literally what's been referred to when Daley was in office was his slush fund, that we still think is actually a slush fund. Hundreds of millions of dollars that is sitting there. Meanwhile, the mayor is proposing to drastically cut hours of libraries and to cut police stations and close schools and all of this, that actually there's no reason to have to do that when there's this money there. And so the question for us is, where are the priorities? And is he a mayor of working families, or is he a mayor solely of the filthy rich? And I think his decision on what he does with this will tell us who he actually is the mayor of.
What do you expect, Don?
Well, I just want to read some numbers that I think tell the story.
Just a few.
Just a few, very
Just
short.
a few numbers.
This is among the budget cuts. Finance and administration, 3.1%. Legislative and elections, 9.5%. Infrastructure, down 1%. City development, public safety, and regulatory reduced 2.9, 1.4, and 10.7, respectively. Community services, 17.7%. It's often been said that the poor do not have lobbyists because they can't afford the bribes, and this I think, is the greatest background for a lot of the rest of this conversation.
Now, in fairness, I would imagine a lot of that 17% is based on last year's budget versus this year's, and a lot of that reduction has to do with the slowdown of the flow of state money to the city. But I want to ask Mr. Barnett, you've seen this before, and Amisha brought up the idea of TIF money, and a recent study showed how little money has been spent, and you mentioned it earlier about TIF money being spent on the west side.
Well, our main thing is we don't know what's been spent because we have no representative there. Out of 7 TIFs, you would think that there would be someone representing the west side. I'm going to have to talk to Alderman Munoz about maybe what's been spent. He's next door to us, so maybe he has some inside information. But I thought that's what TIF was for. Like this year, 2011, there will be no menu as far as streets are concerned. Street sidewalks, alleys, any type of road work.
This was the money that was at the alderman's prerogative of where to spend it. It was usually, it is there. Rick says it is in the budget there. So it's just.
But it isn't being done.
Well.
For 2011 because you stopped trying to lay sidewalk and asphalt in November. This is November. So anything that hasn't been laid or put in so far will not be.
Amisha?
Actually, the problem is that there's just not enough money to address the needs, right? So
Yeah.
aldermanic menu money gets spent just very quickly. And the problem, again, and this connects to TIFs again, is that in wealthy areas where there's a huge accumulation of TIF money, frankly, you've got a $50 million aldermanic menu in those TIF districts because that's what you can do with your money, is you can fix sidewalks and streets and streetlights in the South Loop because there's all that extra money because of the TIF there that the aldermans can use. But where communities are on the south side and the west side in low-income neighborhoods where TIF money isn't being generated, there isn't a second layer. So in fact, what happens is it becomes almost like structural racism again, where the money is accumulated in downtown wealthy areas. And frankly, the neighborhoods that need it the most only have the small amount of menu money that can never meet the needs that actually exist in the community.
But Rick, that runs completely counter to what TIFs were designed to do originally, right?
Well, originally, just in a real quick snapshot of these TIFs, TIFs are like a hammer. You can either break a window with it or sculpt a beautiful piece of artwork out of wood or out of stone. So how you use it and what sort of discretion you use it with determines what your product is, what your output is. And the original TIF legislation back from the early 1980s basically had strict adherence to what's called a but-for clause. But for this TIF, this project would happen.
Things would not improve
Things
if it
would
weren't
not
for
improve.
this money,
And
right?
there was 9 criteria that needed to be met in order for a TIF to be viable, to be adopted. And amongst that was that the neighborhood be blighted. We've seen TIFs here in the South Loop and North Loop being implemented where you ask the question, look out this window.
Where's the
Is
blight?
this
Yeah.
neighborhood blighted? And but for this TIF, is this project, whatever project we're talking about, is it viable? Part of the challenge now in the late 90s and early this decade was that in the early 90s, we TIF'd the West Loop over around Whitney Young, Ashland, Jackson, that whole area, in order to attract businesses and invest money into these large former industrial buildings that are now offices and condos. And developers came through and says, oh, I need some TIF assistance in order to make this a good office building. And the city acquiesced, provided the $1.2, $2, $3, $5 million for different buildings. And then all of a sudden, the LaSalle Street TIF was going to be expiring, and they said, no, but we need it because our office space is now going to the West Loop. So you've got TIFs fighting each other for tenants, competing each other for tenants, and the question of but for this TIF isn't really being answered. It's basically being decided that we've got the money, there's going to be an increment, let's secure it, that this is what the city's position was, let's capture it, and then spend it downtown, as opposed to allowing that tax increase to go back into the neighborhoods,
And that's
which is the reverse of linked development.
exactly. And how Rahm Emanuel handles this, whether there's a change in that trend, is going to determine, I think, whether TIF has a future at all, or whether it just becomes another inadvertent means of creating the divide between the haves and the have-nots.
And that's why this week's budget conversation, what Ms. Patel referred to as the surplus, the amount of money that
The city declared a surplus as part of the source of money they're going to balance the
would
budget.
like to declare a surplus.
Well, they feel they don't have to answer to anyone. Otherwise, we would have some representation on that committee that's going to decide how the money is spent.
Correct.
Other folks don't know how we need to spend money. We want to bring in some manufacturing. We have a lot of plants on the west side that could use some TIF money that would bring some jobs in.
Well, so Rick, what?
So to their credit, to the budget's office and the mayor's credit, in this proposed budget, they are proposing to declare a 20% surplus of the unallocated money that's in TIFs over $5 million, that have over $5 million in them. Because a lot of the TIFs that we have are neighborhood TIFs and are newer TIFs and
Right.
don't necessarily have a budget. So they set up some criteria and declared that would, and are proposing that we declare a 20% surplus. What that means is that basically $55 million will be captured back to the taxing bodies. Of that $55 million, half of it goes to the Board of Education, 20% goes to the City of Chicago, and the rest goes to the other 11 taxing bodies, the Library Board,
The county.
Water Reclamation District, the
City College Board.
City colleges, there's 11 of them.
Yeah.
I always have a hard time remembering all 13 of them. But what that means is that there is unused money there, which is what Amisha and some of the members of the press have called the slush fund, that we can capture so that we don't have this budget crisis / revenue crisis, and the money's there. So the negotiations going on right now between the mayor's office, the budget office, and the city council is, okay, you said 20. What happens if we go to 35? It's unallocated, it's unencumbered.
Unencumbered.
Uncommitted.
Because Daley used to say the money was encumbered by borrowing.
What happens if we go
Right.
to 35? What happens if we go to 40? What happens if we go to 50? Does that mean then that we don't need to cut libraries? Does then that mean that we don't need to close 6 of the 12 mental health clinics? Does that mean that we can not have to lay off members of the Office of Emergency Communications so that public safety is not impacted? So that is, you know, to their credit, they started the conversation, a conversation that Rich Daley would never have had. And now the issue is to what degree?
Well, and if I might,
Sure.
and actually I think it goes to the point
I'm going to
that's
wrap this portion up and move on to some other stuff.
Just really important to point the fact of what community organizing does to get us even to that point, right? That the mayor was actually refusing to declare a TIF surplus at all until the Grassroots Collaborative and other organizations started organizing and put in an ordinance that asked for 50%. So the fact that they came to the table with 20% was absolutely a result of community organizing and labor organizing together, right? And so that we can have the conversation and the negotiation that aldermen can really push with. So I think it's just important to bring that an element in as well.
Moving on to a different subject, the mayor has made a bit of a show, I would say, about standing up to the unions at City Hall and at the school board and elsewhere. But I wonder what is the real relationship there, because there have been a lot of instances where some of the union leadership have been justifiably embarrassed by some of the excesses and some of the things that we've seen. But as the Civic Federation pointed out in their look at the budget, the pension problems that the city faces are just monumental, and it makes the entire budget really unsustainable over the long haul. And that sets up a big fight between this mayor and many of the unions. So, Don Rose, what do you think? Is this mayor going to take on the unions in such a way that that pension issue can be resolved rather, or what's going to happen there?
The pension issue is vast, and I don't mean to make light of it, but it's very popular, as we have seen in Wisconsin, Ohio, Alabama, a number of places, to jump all over the public employee unions, which are really the last vestige of trade unions in America. Labor unions made the middle class in America. Somehow or another, it becomes almost heroic in some quarters to take on the public unions, policemen, firemen, and of all people, teachers, the most vital, valuable people, public servants in the country. And I think he is doing a lot of muscle flexing by, quote, taking on. Just that very phrase is one that suggests a kind of heroism, when in fact it is a kind of destructivism. I don't think you should be taking on the unions. I don't think you should be taking on the public employee unions. There are unions where there are excesses, as we've seen at McCormick Place. There's no question that there have been corrupt and overbearing unions with stupid rules. But for most of these public employee unions, you're talking about the lifeblood of the city. And the idea of, quote, taking them on is not a very heroic idea to me.
Richard Barnett, let me just ask you, is this a fight that the mayor needs to have? The pension problem being what it is, tens of millions of dollars, so is it, Rick, $17 billion or some amount that's phenomenal, that pension funds are underfunded without reforming the unions? And that means, to me, I think, taking them on and changing the way things are done. How can that problem be solved if he doesn't do that?
I think that's why they're called collective bargaining. I'm surprised that they can't deal with that as far as the bargaining is concerned. But as a rule, they're trying to knock them out totally. And looking at these cities, some of our major cities, that's what they want to do is cut out the union.
Amisha, what do you think? Is this an issue that can be resolved without changing the way that the city and the unions have the relationship between those two entities?
I think the reason why we have a pension problem is because the state has not met its obligations, right? So the fact is that employees have been putting in their share. You have many other states that are actually, their pensions are fully funded because of, people actually we've been sort of hedging our bets against the pensions for many, many years. So I think that, it's a convenient time for any elected official to say that the issue here is pensions, and then we need to sort of break union hold over their retirements. And actually, I think it's a convenient way to basically try to break political power, which I think is more what this is about. And I think that's what you've seen in other states in the Midwest and across this country, that the economic crisis has given permission for folks to really try to go after the last stranglehold of political power, which is organized labor. So I think that if you're going to talk about, yes, we need to figure out something about pensions, but it shouldn't be that it's working families and low-income workers that are the ones that have to sacrifice when it's been actually elected officials that have not met their obligations that they should have been meeting this whole time.
We talked about the unions in terms of the city and the teachers as well. We've seen not a confrontation between the administration in the form of school board, the head of the school board, the head of the school administration, Mr. Brizard, and the head of the teachers union over the longer day fight, which I think is just a surrogate fight for when the contract talks start. I would imagine they're going to start next year. Rick, is this a fight that he needs to be picking?
I don't think so. I don't think anybody disagrees. Longer school days are better.
And that's going to happen. State law will say so next year.
It's going to happen. Keeping young men and women, keeping children in school longer, but it's got to be done right. And by that I mean, appropriate curriculum needs to be developed, facilities need to be in place, personnel needs to be lined up, and who here will work an extra month without an extra month's pay? That's just a basic question. So the teachers union isn't against the longer school day. The question is just how do you do it? So I think that the fight that was picked by Brizard and the school board with the CTU was one that was unnecessary. And one could have gotten to the longer school day in a much better way had they been more engaging with each other, because this whole thing of I'm going to ram it down your throat and I'm going to go to each individual school and get them to vote, I mean, that's borderline union busting.
I think Don Rose might agree.
I disagree to an extent. The longer school day by itself is not the answer.
That's what the unions.
We have the shortest school day one of the shortest school days in America, but Japan has an even shorter school day than we do, and they have a hell of an education system. I suggest that it's not a matter of the hours, which is the technocratic answer once again, and it's not a matter of the standardized testing and so on and so
You
forth.
say technocrat like it's a bad thing.
I think it's a lousy term when it conflicts with human values.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's what it's doing here. It's a matter of what goes on in that classroom, whether you're in there for 6 hours or 9 hours. 3 more hours a day of the same crap that they've been getting under this so-called school reform, which, as we've recently seen, has made no progress in 20 years, despite the very, very good publicity that Mr. Daley had, and that this terrible woman in Washington, D.C. had, and that Joe Klein had in New York. School reform, basing it on standardized tests, basing it on charter schools, is not the answer. All of these so-called miracles have proven to be frauds, if not criminal frauds. What goes on in... Forgive me for making a speech, but I love to make speeches, and I like to be applauded. So, I know we need sound bites tonight. We need sound bites tonight. So, having said that, I think you know where I am.
Okay, but how does how do we achieve what needs to be achieved by perpetuating the same system. I mean, isn't that the definition of idiocy?
We don't want to perpetuate the same system, and the problem is, Rahm comes out of the Obama administration, wherein we have Arnie Duncan, who was making the same mistakes that Paul Vallis was making, who was one of the founders of this so-called school reform. We need a genuine reform, and I'm sorry to say that great liberals such as Bill Clinton, back with his predecessor to No Child Left Behind, and Arnie Duncan, who plays pretty good basketball, I guess, was made Secretary of Education the same way that the guy from Houston was made Secretary of Education by George Bush. The guy from Houston had a, quote, miracle too, until they found out that that miracle was based on fraud. A lot of erasures on the tests, a lot of plain old lies, such as we've been fed to for the past 20 years by the Daley, Vallis, Duncan administration.
Richard Barnett, haven't there been successes in the Chicago schools that can serve as a template, that can serve as a model for how things can be done in a more efficient, more productive form? Whenever we ask this question of school administrators or people who have done it, what they say are two things. They say a dedicated principal who assembles a competent staff and engages the parents of the students. Isn't that the simple formula?
Well, that's what they say is a simple formula. But we're going to also have to bring in people from the community into our schools. I was on the local school council at my neighborhood school for 11 years. We brought a lot of parents in. It got us off probation because parents got to know the kids, got to know their parents, and they could interact with them. A lot of parents don't interact with anyone, with each other.
Yet the power of the local school councils has been eroded under former Mayor Daley, and I don't see that trend changing under this mayor.
Yeah.
Let's change subjects, something not quite so difficult. It's only crime and police protection. We can talk about that for a little while. We mentioned a little bit earlier about the fact that the mayor is reluctant to tell us how he's going to be deploying police personnel and deploying people, taking people away from high crime areas if that's necessary and putting them in other crime areas. Yet we do see crime edging downward, and isn't there something to be said for the way things have been handled both by the former superintendent and the current superintendent? I mean, do they get no credit for a reduction in crime?
But is crime edging downward? A lot of crime is not even reported.
Index crimes, the ones that the FBI keeps track of.
A lot of them isn't even reported.
Well, it would be difficult to keep
So
track of
that's
something we can't get a report on.
Right. So you really can't say where it's going.
Yeah, Rick, the hiring and the plan for the police department, from what I understand, isn't even going to keep pace with attrition. And Rahm's notion that he put 1,000 new cops on the street is kind of a semantic issue. He's moved people around, and there may be more people in uniform on beats now than there used to be. But if you believe that more cops means more protection, which some of the superintendents have argued about, don't you have to hire above and beyond attrition in order to achieve that?
Part of the challenge in dealing with the public safety issue with police is that a couple of 6 years ago, the Rich Daley administration started slowing down the hiring of new recruits to the academy as a way to fix the budget shortfall. And it added up to the point where this last year we had roughly about 1,500 vacancies in the police department. Line items that the city council had approved to be hired, but were not filled, were not deployed because there was just no money in the budget. To his credit, Mayor Emanuel this year said, look, we're going to get rid of the vacancies because we're just fudging with the numbers. And he did commit to hiring an additional 200 officers. But just this year, notwithstanding the 1,500 vacancy shortage that we have from last year, just this year, over 450 officers are going to either retire or transition out of their jobs for whatever reason. 450, and if we only hire 200, that means we're already at a deficit. And we all know that in community policing, 95% of the job is presence, where you have to have a beat officer walking the beat. Well over 10 years ago, a couple of aldermen and I introduced an ordinance in the city council requiring the police department to redesign their beats based on population shifts. We redistrict wards every 10 years. We redistrict congressional districts every 10 years. Why can't we redistrict the police redeployments to beats, which is how they're being deployed? And for the obvious reasons that you mentioned earlier, the Daley administration just refused. Part of what's happening now with Superintendent McCarthy and Mayor Emanuel is a concrete look at what those crime statistics mean. And yes, index crimes might be going down, but violent crimes are still a huge problem in this city. The shootings, I mean, every Sunday morning, every Monday morning, listen to the news radios, to the talk shows, read the papers, and there will be an article that says, and this weekend, these 7 shootings happened. The shortage not only gets to how do you prevent the crime, but then also with being about 220, 230 detectives short in the city, is how do you solve these crimes? The closure rate. Solving these crimes is not a priority right now because we don't have the detectives to staff all those crimes, to staff all those investigations. And so that becomes a problem, and that goes back to the issue of how many officers are we hiring per year and how many are we losing?
Amisha Patel, when it comes to economic development, does the city's crime rate work against it? Does the police deployment practices, does the impression of Chicago as a dangerous place work against its ability to grow jobs and create business interest?
Well, I think, a big problem is folks who actually live in neighborhoods that actually, that don't feel like they can live safely because they can't. It's connected to so many of the things that we've talked about, right? So foreclosures and abandoned buildings and the fact that these are located closely to schools, and the fact that of all the sort of dangerous things that happen to families every day just on the streets that they live in. And I think from that perspective, there's it's very hard for folks to continue to figure out how to have good, decent lives here, let alone, I think the less of the worry is what other folks think of the city, right? I think the reality of families in Chicago, in particular, in lots of the neighborhoods in the city, is that people see that it just feels like things are getting worse and worse. And and at this time, if we're talking about less resources in, and I think honestly, when the mayor's talked about adding 1,000 new officers onto the streets, he really hasn't. I mean, they've been moved around, but they were already on the streets.
500 or 600 of them were from specialized units that had been doing special jobs on the street.
Right. And so I think you may think that's one issue, but I think it's also how do we think about investing in sort of non-criminal. There's, I think, increasingly young people in particular are feeling criminalized in the fact that even in the schools that there's now sometimes, I think in 14 schools there's cameras in the schools that directly are connected to Chicago Police District stations. And so I think there's a real question here of how do we actually make sure that folks are safe, and what does safety look like, and what are all the different ways that we can think about safety, because it does go beyond policing.
The previous mayor, the previous superintendent talked about technology as kind of a solution, as kind of almost a substitute for officers on the street, officers in cars, officers being what Rick called a presence in the community. Richard Barnett, do people feel safe if they see a camera on the side of a school? Do they feel safe if they see a blue light flashing in their neighborhood?
They do. But it also takes down your property values.
Because if you see that light, that's a sign that says high crime area.
Mm-hmm.
So what would be your suggestion when the mayor comes to you and asks you for your suggestion of how to address this? What do you tell him?
Well, I think people have to get it together. People know who lives on their street. Anyone I live on the corner of an alley. Any car or truck or anything else that goes down my alley, I've got his license plate. So should something happen, that's one way that you can slow down crime.
Let's change gears a little bit. I want to talk about something that's going to be in the news for, probably the next 6 months to a year, and that's the ward remap. The ward remap is underway, and because of demographic changes, population shifts, different groups are clamoring for more representation, more wards. Other groups are trying to hang on to what they've got, and my guess is it's going to end up in court. But the question for us here tonight is, what role does Rahm Emanuel play in that? Does he keep hands off of that? I can't imagine so, but how does he make his wishes is felt in this? And Rick, I'm going to wait on you. You're going to have time to consider your answer. I'll ask Don first. I mean, you've been through a few remaps. What is the mayor's role in a remap? What is this mayor's role going to be?
Well, if I may go back in history a little bit to 1970, which is when the first remap that was created on the basis of the what we used to call one man, one vote, we now call one person, one vote regulation, rule of the Supreme Court in 1962. And that remap that they came up with proved to me and a few others that you could have equally sized wards that still discriminated against minorities. That particular first one shorted blacks by about 3 wards and made no Latino ward. The mayor really has a very heavy hand in this. I am going to assume, although it's a function of the city council, we have not had a legislative city council since Harold Washington, and because they decided they wanted to legislate against the guy with the wrong paint job. But it is a city council function, and they've got to get it done. And the ward map should reflect the face of the city. Few of them have until they've gone to court. Last one, and I think it was 1986, we had a remap come out of the courts that finally gave Harold Washington control of the city council. I have to say, I don't know how heavy a hand Rahm is going to take in this, because most of these guys and women are going to be on Rahm's side anyway. So I'm not sure he cares, for the most part, about remapping enemies out of the city council. But whether he is going to exhibit the fairness that's required, I really don't know, because I've never seen him deal with the issue of fairness before.
Amisha, what do you think? I mean, is this kind of a fight, a potato that's too hot for him to mess with, and he can just deal with whatever is sent to him in terms of a city council?
I can't imagine him not playing a significant role in this.
Good answer.
So I think it is a question of what that means and looks like. But I think he's got his hand, he's got his hand in everything, and certainly something that has such big political implications and issues. I think of also race. He will absolutely be be heavily involved with.
Richard Barnett, the African American population in Chicago is down. Does that have to mean a reduction in the number of predominantly African American wards in the city?
I don't think so, because although we're down, it only means that some folks didn't get counted. It didn't mean that they moved, because we have a compact community. It's not one person here, one there, one there. It's a compact community. In 1990, I drew a map because I was disgusted with what the city council had done, and I won my suit. It cost daily $33 million, but we won the suit. That map, we filed the suit in February of '92. We didn't sell it until September of '98. And Judge Pincham, who was my attorney, didn't get paid till April 1st.
That's
of
a lot
the
of bicycle
following year.
chains.
So I was trying to find the time to go and draw another one as far as this election is concerned. Because what happens in Chicago, folks are trying to make this thing a situation between African Americans and Latinos, and it isn't. Because the Latino population is in a lot of these wards that are headed by white aldermen.
Is that an archaic notion, Rick, that there have to be predominantly this kind of a ward or that kind of a ward, or how is this going to play out, do you think?
Well, you asked the question in terms of how will the mayor
Exactly.
play a
How
role?
will he interact with this?
And this is a clear indicator, and this being our first budget, this being our first 6 months, this being our first redistricting with this mayor, the best metaphor I can come up with is we're learning how to dance with each other. The city council with the mayor, and seeing how much of a hand he wants in on it. Obviously, with the budget, he's heavily invested. With redistricting, I believe he's going to be heavily invested. State law requires us to adopt a redistricting plan by December 1st. If not, it goes to referendum in the next March primary. So we have our hands full this month. And the whole notion that, the concept that some in the media have said that, well, Latinos have grown and blacks have not, so therefore any growth of the Latino community needs to come at the expense of African Americans is misleading, because Latinos have grown, African Americans lost within their contiguity, within their neighborhoods, but so did whites. Okay, and if you look at where Latinos are moving to, where those communities are becoming Latino communities, you're talking about the 10th ward, the 23rd ward, the 13th ward, the 36th ward, wards that are not represented by African Americans. So given the fact, and laws on our side on this one, given the fact that African Americans are a protected class in the Section 2 Voting Rights Act, and so are Latinos, then that means that whatever growth, and I'm saying 4 to 6 wards, 4 to 6 wards need to grow to be, 4 to 6 wards need to be predominantly Latino. That means that 60% of the population needs to be voting age population Latino, as defined by the 7th Circuit. Then that growth does not need to come at the expense of African Americans, because they are a protected class within the Voting Rights Act, which means then where does it come from?
There's only one other source.
There's only one other source, and then that's why, the 10th ward's already 57% Latino. The 13th ward, which is represented by Mike Madigan, is already about 55% Latino. The 23rd ward is 57 Latino. So there's ways of redrawing these maps that can bring them up.
To say nothing of Ed Burke's ward.
Ed Burke's been 80% for 12 years. 14 years. Ed Burke was the Latino ward.
Senior Burke, you mean, right? Senior Burke.
Senor Burke, yes.
Mel's ward is 85%.
But let me just backtrack a bit in terms of saying that.
I need to ask you to wrap it up,
yes,
too.
real quick. What we're saying is that the district should be a supermajority ward, which means 60% of the population is Latino. That doesn't mean they elect a Latino, which gets me to the point of Mel and Burke. Alderman Mel and Alderman Burke both represent 70% plus Latino districts, and they're non-Latinos. They haven't learned to speak Spanish, but they continue to get reelected.
And Tom Murphy used to head a predominantly black ward when he
Correct.
was an alderman. And finally, and I can't believe our time is just about wrapped up, but I have a final question, and I'm going to have to ask you to keep your answers short, but this requires you to gaze into your crystal ball and ask yourself about what Ram's ambition is. It looks like to me that he's building a resume for something. I don't know what, and I don't know when, but Don Rose, do you agree, and what do you think that might be?
Well, as they once said about Bill Clinton, he would like to use the White House as a stepping stone.
Richard Barnett, what do you think? Is this going to be a 20-year mayor or a two-termer, and if so, what after that?
Well, I hope he'll step on to wherever he wants to go.
Amisha Patel.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine him being satisfied with being in office of mayor for more than a couple of terms. Where he wants to go after this is unclear, but I think it's clear that he does want to move somewhere else.
Rick Mundis is a man who understands political ambition. What do you think?
Being an alderman is the best job in the world, because you're the mayor of your little neighborhood.
That's right.
And I can't imagine why anybody would want to give up being mayor of the city of Chicago. Look out the window. It's the most beautiful city in the country, as some would say, in the world. So what he might want to move on to, I don't know, but I don't know why he would want to move anywhere else.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank our panel, Richard Barnett, Ricardo Munoz, Don Rose, and Amisha Patel. And thanks, of course, to WBEZ, CAN TV, and the folks here at the Cliff Dwellers Club. And thanks to you for participating. I'm David Stewart.